Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Shatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Mosaic Press. Dalet El is the 100th yahrzeit of Rav Simcha of Dvinsk, the author of Ar Sameach and Meshech Chochmah. Discover the brilliance of the Meshech Chochmah with Rabbi Emanuel Bernstein's carefully chosen English selections, expanded and elucidated with clarity, warmth, and depth. Readers will embark on an exhilarating journey through this classic of Torah literature and benefit from clear and engaging access to its methodology, thought process, and core principles. The book is available now for the special price of $29.99 from mosaicpress.com. You can find the link to purchase the book in the show notes. This episode of the podcast is also sponsored by koshercloth.com. One thing I appreciate about koshercloth.com is how easy they make buying stam. Whether you're looking for a tefillin, mezuzahs, a megillah, or even a sefer Torah, they take the time to explain the options, answer your questions, and help you find what's right for your needs and budget. To learn more, visit koshercloth.com or call or WhatsApp 516-737-5436. They have pickup options in New York and New Jersey, as well as fast shipping across the country. You can find the link and information in the show notes below. To sponsor an episode or to support the podcast, please email me svarimchatter@gmail.com. You can also find a link and more information in the show notes. You can also find a link in the show notes to subscribe to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Svarim, and book deals. There's also a link to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp status, which is more of the same if you prefer seeing in a status. And finally, if you can please rate and review the podcast wherever it is listening to podcasts, and of course subscribe to the podcast. And with that, enjoy this episode. Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Professor Marc Shapiro, who holds the Weinberg Chair in Judaic Studies at the University of Scranton. He's authored a number of books, and in this episode we'll be discussing his newest book, which is Renewing the Old, Sanctifying the New, the unique vision of Rav Kook, published by Littman Library. So thank you, Professor Shapiro, for joining me once again.
I'm happy to be here again.
Okay, I first want to mention that this episode is sponsored anonymously. Nishmas, Hindel, Mirel, Bas, Menachem, Yosef. Your yahrzeit is Aleph Elul, so we'll have passed around the time of we're posting this episode, and she exemplified the natural morality Rav Kook talks about. So that's something we're going to get into here on this episode of what this book's about. Okay, so let's dive right in. Rav Kook's yahrzeit now, and I did the a 3-part series with Professor Yehuda Mirsky a few years ago on Rav Kook, really the full bio, but this is something that you write about in the book, because I feel like it's when I do those podcasts, right, on those Chumash books, it's like, wait, another Sefer on Chumash? It's like Rav Kook, another book on Rav Kook? What's different here? Why are you writing another book on Rav Kook?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, Rav Kook is one of the most written about great sages we have. And I think many people know the major themes, and it's repeated again and again, the idea that Jewish history doesn't stand still, that we have a role to play in bringing redemption, that the centrality of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, is a focus of nationalism, religious Zionism, the unity of the Jewish people, the need to reach out to sinners in our day and age because they're really not sinning consciously, but the zeitgeist is pushing them in that direction. And these are all the big ideas that everyone knows about. And there was no need for me to write a book to rehash all that. However, when I first started studying Rav Kook seriously about 25 years ago, I began noticing, and that's, by the way, when the new writings begin to appear with the Shmona Kvatzim, until even a few years ago, the last of the new works that came out, I began to notice that there are many themes that I find significant, but are not even mentioned, or mentioned only very little, and certainly not the focus of much scholarship. So what I've tried to do is focus on these areas that haven't been the focus of scholarship. Many of them are quite provocative. In fact, many of them were suppressed, actively suppressed, because they contain ideas that are thought to be radical, and they certainly have not been regarded as part of the standard way Rav Kook is presented. So that's what I did in the book, deal with a variety of themes which are of interest to me and have not received the attention they have deserved, in my opinion.
Yeah, and so we'll discuss a number of those. And so it's different. Like if you're looking for the classic treatment of Rav Kook, biography, Professor Mirsky's great book, 2 books rather, and then if you're looking for some other thought like this, the Zionism, all that classic kind of stuff is discussed elsewhere. You're not going to find it in this book. This book is addressing something else.
No, and in fact, many people maybe are turned off to Rav Kook because they don't find appealing his form of Zionism or many of the standard ideas. I think what my book shows is that even if you don't buy into that model of Zionism or how he viewed, the era we're in, there still is a lot in Rav Kook that you can benefit from, that you can take away. Now, you might say, as many perhaps would, that a lot of the ideas I speak about, including his suppressed Guide of the Perplexed, he wrote an entire Guide Mar Nevuchim, that these are all ideas that he wrote when he was in Chutz La'aretz. And when he came to Eretz Yisrael, there's like a new Rav Kook, and therefore these ideas have been rejected. Now, I don't accept that, and I don't see any evidence of that, but even if that was the case, all that would mean is that we have two Rav Kooks. The Rav Kook before, and he was a Gadol also, before he came to Eretz Yisrael, but there's no evidence of this. In fact, his major writings, in fact, his classical wrote, not the Orta Kodesh, they all come from the Shmona Kvatzim, and so the idea that only certain parts of this book are to be studied and other are not, I don't accept. So there's a whole world out there of ideas that people can examine and benefit from that really have nothing to do with his, or very little to do with an acceptance of his other major ideas on Zionism and the new era we're entering, etc.
Right, and we're going to get into some of those writings, at least as it pertains to this episode, because you mentioned the Nevuch Adar, Rav Kook's guide for today's perplexes. Well, that was just recently, actually very recently, translated and annotated into English by Rabbi Aryeh Sklar, published by Kodesh Press. So for those that are interested in that volume and to read that, but like you said, that was a recent publication. But before we, I want to talk about some of the writings in particular that you focus on, and as before we get to the thought. But why did you decide to write a book on Rav Kook? You've written on many topics. Why did you decide, okay, even though it's this understudied part of Rav Kook, that you're going to research and write on Rav Kook?
And it's not something that people would expect from me. It wasn't really my area, but it was precisely when I started reading the suppressed writings of Rav Kook, and there's a whole story as how they were unsuppressed, if that's a word, that I began to be drawn to aspects that really relate to other areas of my scholarship that I've written about. So I was able to tie a lot of these ideas to long-ranging interests of mine because, like I said, if it was just the standard views of Rav Kook and the so-called standard writings, what they call the Shas Havan, the white, his books are all in this white, the standard volumes, that, truth be told, I don't know if this gets me thrown out of, my circles. I never was much attracted to those Rav Kook's standard views of religious Zionism and many of the other things. There were, of course, things in there that I am attracted to, but it's precisely in the new writings that I found a lot that really is in line with many of my longstanding interests. So that's what drove me to them. And I began by writing posts on the Sfarim blog, and then I thought, wait a second, there's a lot of material here, and why not turn it into a book? And that's why I wrote the book.
Now, suppressed writings, that's a favorite of yours, talking about censorship and suppression.
Correct.
And, I realize here, actually, now that we're live when we're recording this, I'm like, actually, we've never done an episode of Changing the Immutable. I don't know how that's possible on your book, but we actually didn't do one, so maybe we'll have to do one. But, okay, let's talk about the Rav Kook's, let's talk about his writings. So again, I refer everyone back to listen to that mini-series I did with Professor Mirsky. We really went through everything, but especially the writings in the context of your book and this topic that will be these topics rather that we'll be discussing here on this episode.
Let me just say, I listened to the 3 episodes you had with Yehuda Mirsky, and they were fantastic. And you didn't even need to ask many questions. He's just a wonderful speaker, and he's really an expert on it. And he actually, in one of his volumes, did have access to some of the new writings. But, the standard writings, Orot, Orta Kodesh, are the big ones. And then you have his collected essays, the Mamarim, etc. Okay, so leave that aside. But beginning in 1999, and then it was published, the Shmona Kvatzim, the 8 notebooks, in which so much of his standard writings come out of. But now we saw for the first time Rav Kook's works without the gatekeepers, as it were. And you don't need to look, for example, at how it's formulated in Orot. You can see exactly what Rav Kook wrote. And that was the first insight we had into that there were changes that were made, as well as obviously passages that were not allowed to appear. Subsequent to that, we have Rabbi Boaz Ofan. We published Kvatzim Michtav Yad Kodsho, it's called. And we have a series of other writings that appeared, which really gives us a much broader insights into Rav Kook. And the most important thing is that we're seeing Rav Kook as he wrote it. He almost had a magic pen. He just, every thought that came to him, he wrote. Sometimes it'll go on for a few pages, other times just a few lines, little aphorisms. And so it's these writings in particular that I've chosen to focus on in the book, mostly, but not entirely, because, you still have a good deal in his other writings. Some of the themes we'll speak about, he mentions it, he alludes to it in the so-called standard classic writings. And then, of course, there's Linvuchei Adar, which you mentioned. Rav Kook wrote a Guide of the Perplexed, just like the Rambam wrote in his day, in the medieval period, dealing with issues that were confronting Jews, Aristotelianism, Plato's views, the philosophy of its day. Rav Kook in the 19th century said that there's a whole new era that we have to confront, new science, new philosophy, and Rav Kook attempted to confront these problems and how religious Jews should deal with these. So he follows the Rambam's approach, but deals with completely new challenges. And that book is although we knew it existed. It's mentioned shortly after Rav Kook died, it didn't appear, and mysteriously in 2010 it appears on the internet. No one knows how it got on there, and then it comes out a few years later in a nice, beautiful edition with footnotes. And as you mentioned, Rabbi Aryeh Sklar, recently his English translation of it appeared. So this is not an example of Rav Kook. His magic pen, as I termed it, just writing almost like Benevuah, just coming out of him, overflowing, effervescent. These are carefully thought out chapters in which Rav Kook deals with the issues of the day and offers his approach to how religious Jews should confront them.
Now, who was suppressing these writings?
Well, this was his son, Ritzi Yehuda Kook. Now, it's interesting because Rav Kook himself said, there's one passage where he says that you can't hold back the light. He refers to his works, orot, to various orots. He says you can't hold back the light. But he says, but my censors don't let everything get out there. And who are his censors? His censors were his son, Rav Yehuda Kook, and the Nazir, and also to a certain extent Rav Charlap. Those were his three great students. Rav Charlap was, you'd call it maybe a Talmud Chaver. And Rav Yehuda lived the longest, and he was in control of all the manuscripts, and he refused to allow these writings to appear. You can see in certain areas why he would, because Rav Kook says could be seen as subversive. Rav Yehuda tried to present a version of Rav Kook as basically, or of Merkaz Harav, as Volozhin with a Zionist flavor. But if you read Rav Kook's unpublished writings, the recently published ones, you see also the idea of a tzaddik. Rav Kook's connections to Chassidut is quite significant. His universalistic themes, all the controversial issues I guess I discuss about would be reason enough for Tzvi Yehuda to feel that it shouldn't be out there. Now, there's different approaches to this among Rav Kook's Talmidim, or the Talmidim today, or third, fourth generation. Some look at it as today, as Rav Yoel Ben Nun put it, Rav Yehuda didn't publish this because he wanted Rav Kook to be accepted in the Haredi circles. But since they're not going to accept him, there's no reason today not to put it out there. Others have said that it's not about the Haredim, it's even about in our world, they say, in the Rav Kook world, that some ideas, the generation is not yet ready for it. So therefore, we have to hold this back until the generation is ready for it. So there's all different reasons given as to why these writings should be kept hidden away. In fact, Rav Shlomo Aviner, who's a leading member of the Chardal school of thought and from Merkaz Harav, when the Shmona Kvatzim came out, he said it's forbidden to read it. It's usur. He says because everything in Rav Kook's writings you have to go through his interpreter, Ritzi Yehuda, and the Nazir. But if you read Rav Aviner today, he cites the Shmona Kvatzim because after 25 years, they became accepted, and you can't not cite them. Well, when the Linvuchei Adar appeared, Rav Aviner again said it's forbidden to cite it. It's forbidden to study it because it doesn't reflect Rav Kook's final ideas, and Rav Yehuda obviously didn't want it to appear. So I dare say that in another 20 years, he should live and be well, Rav Aviner will also be citing Linvuchei Adar because there's so many important insights. That doesn't mean you have to say that Rav Kook held on to every view. It's possible that later on, when he comes to Eretz Yisrael, he has a much more negative view of Christianity than we see in Linvuchei Adar. There could be changes. Look, Rav Yaakov Weinberg said that great thinkers don't see it as a compliment if you say about them that everything in them is at peace and there's no changes, there's no tensions. Great thinkers are always full of tension, different views, changing their mind. So we see this with Rav Kook as well.
Let's dive into some of that thought, because these kind of thoughts, and you say your book is really focused on these newer volumes, if you will, and kind of the thought that's there. So it's not only the understudy part, it's the part, the material is understudied because it came from volumes that weren't really around for this very reason. So let's jump in there, and each chapter in the book really addresses another topic, more or less, if you will, so we can pick on some of them and discuss some of them. And, you started right away, where is Rav Kook's soul? Which, by the way, we should mention that in the beginning of the book, the way you started, and you say, for those who never read Rav Kook and don't understand why, just pick up one of these books and just read it, and you'll be captivated right away.
Yeah. And, well, that's the question, where is his soul? Because he's often portrayed as as basically a Talmudist, a halachist, a posek, and that's really most of his time was spent on. But occasionally, on his free time, when he wanted to relax for things, he would then study philosophy. Now, that's also how Rav Soloveitchik is portrayed, but really Rav Soloveitchik was a Talmudist. That was his be-all and end-all. The other things are extra things. But with Rav Kook, it's not that at all. It's just the opposite. Rav Kook tells us that his real soul is in his, his writings on his non-halachic writings, be it mysticism, philosophy. He says that when it comes to halacha, he can do it. He's good at it, but he has to do it. He's a Rav, so he has to poskin. That's not where his heart is. That's not where his soul is. If he could, he simply would be soaring the stratosphere, trying to connect to God in a mystical sense. So what we see clearly, especially from the newer writings, is that Rav Kook, if you want to categorize him, he is a great posek, but he says that that's not where his originality is, and that's not where his soul was. He was really focused on other areas internally.
And as you discussed, is halacha always essential? Now, I think we should right away qualify, wait, what does that mean? What do you mean by that? What does Rav Kook mean by that?
So what do we mean by is halacha always essential? The Rambam already points out that, Jewish law sometimes will affect some people negatively. That's just the way with any legal system is. And if that's all Rav Kook was speaking about, there wouldn't be anything so radical here. But what Rav Kook says, and this relates to the idea of where his soul is, he speaks about that some people who study halacha, they feel alienated from it. What he calls the prate. Maybe you get certain Hasidic tendencies here that, what you think of Hasidus. In the literature world, the posek he's the leader. But in the Hasidic world, the Rebbe is the leader. The posek is the technician. And what we see with Rav Kook is that he feels himself being held down by halachic particulars. Of course, you need to follow the halacha, but he shows that there's two sides of this. There's a problem that his soul, and he speaks about certain people, he's speaking about himself, that they feel constricted by the details, not just the study, but the practices of halacha, or halacha, we could say, speak Ashkenazic. And that really raises the issue, which you don't, if you read Rav Soloveitchik, the details of halacha all form themselves into this great system. But Rav Kook is calling attention that for certain people, halacha can be problematic. So how do you deal with that? So then you have to go to the next step. If focusing on the particulars, and that could mean learning in the particulars or detailed, what does that do to spirituality when you're trying to connect? Think of the Passover Seder, perhaps. When you're so busy focusing on it, is this a shear? Is my maror big enough? And then you forget the forest for the trees, that the whole purpose of the Seder is, what it teaches you about redemption and connection to God, because you're focusing on the nitty-gritty. Heschel once said that the problem with Orthodox Jews is that they're not in awe of God, they're in awe of the Shulchan Aruch. So Rav Kook was very cognizant of this problem, this difficulty, this challenge, and he's trying to provide a solution for it. So when we say is halacha always essential, because it even goes beyond that. He focuses on facts that in the Messianic era, perhaps there'll be changes in halacha. We'll move beyond certain halachot. So he recognizes that today we can't change it. We'll get into this when we speak about the Sanhedrin, but he realizes that, as the Rambam says, this may be the best we have at present, but it doesn't mean that the way we do it at present is the way it will always be done. He even refers to passages that speak about prayer. That certain great sages, maybe they would only have to pray once a month. Prayer's the same problem. I mean, how can you be, originally they didn't have to pray. You prayed when you wanted to with your own words, but because most people can't do that, the sages set up, a formula for us, words we have to say. Well, what about those people who are still at that level when, as if they could be Tanaim themselves, what are they supposed to do? They're forced, on the one hand, they have to follow the halacha, they have to say the words that they've been taught. On the other hand, to say that this isn't going to affect them spiritually is short-sighted. They're going to have to find a way to deal with these things. And Rav Kook speaks about that the great tzaddik, he has to sacrifice his spirituality for the sake of the people. So he too has to daven like everyone else, even though if the whole world was like him, you wouldn't need these formulaic, because he'd be able to connect to God in his own way like we used to do before Chazal formulated the prayers. So these are fascinating ideas, and of course always raises the question, and what's going to be in the Messianic era? Are we going to return perhaps to a pre-rabbinic state? And we find some fascinating allusions to this as well.
The complaint about the nitty-gritty of halacha reminds me of someone else's complaint, but we'll leave that. Now, broad Jewish knowledge, philosophical knowledge, secular studies knowledge, this is an always question, right? This is not a one-time question. This always comes up. And what was Rav Kook's opinion on whether we should have a broad philosophical knowledge?
His opinion itself is very broad. On the one hand, he speaks about how there's a necessity for people who are ready for it, including the great Torah sages, to acquaint themselves with secular knowledge, also with a wide Jewish philosophical curriculum. And it's not just about secular knowledge, which he's not afraid of, but also that we've limited ourselves too much in Torah studies that all we recognize now is halacha and Talmud, when there's so much more. He even says that opposition to secular studies could come from really deep down. People hate knowledge, even Torah knowledge, and they're expressing it this way. On the other hand, practically, Rav Kook, when he opened his yeshiva, he never established like a Torah Derech Eretz type of yeshiva. He only focused on Torah study there. So it does seem that he thought the generation wasn't yet ready for his broad vision, and but for certain individuals who were ready for it, he did recommend for them to expand themselves, broaden themselves.
There's also the negative part, not just the positive, right? One, the positive is like, should you learn broader philosophical knowledge, like you said, even Jewish, not only non-Jewish, but the negative is the dangers of a limited education, if we're limited knowledge.
He makes a fascinating point there. He says that just like if someone doesn't know all the halachic shitos, he has to be machmir, because he doesn't know about the different views. And we understand that to be a great posek, you have to have a broad-ranging. We can't imagine someone who is a great posek but doesn't have shas at his fingertips and doesn't know the Rishonim. He says we have a problem, because the people who are speaking today about, and he's speaking about his rabbinic contemporaries, about Jewish ideas, we say theology, they don't have a broad knowledge. Their knowledge is also very limited. So this creates a problem, because in their mind, they don't know how to distinguish, for instance, they don't know Yehuda Levi, and they don't know Rav Sadia Gaon and the Ralbag, etc. And therefore, their view of what acceptable Jewish doctrine is very limited. And they also don't know how to distinguish between principles of faith, Ikarei Emunah, and just beliefs that have been traditional but are not obligatory and don't need to be held onto as an Ikar in Emunah. And therefore, when new ideas come out, when new possibilities, these figures, lacking the wide-ranging knowledge they should have, immediately declare it's forbidden. It's forbidden. And therefore, people could be led to heresy because of this. Well, how could they be led to heresy? Because they're told that, he doesn't say what he's referring to, but it could be matters such as evolution or age of the universe, whatever it is. They're told that if you believe that the universe, they're being, on the one hand, these people are being told by science, that is these young Jews, that the world, let's say, is billions of years old. But then the rabbi says to them, no, it's an Ikar Emunah that you must believe that the world is only 5,700 something. And since the rabbi says this is an Ikar Emunah, and therefore, if you deny this, you're a heretic, this will lead them to heresy, because they feel they cannot accept a 5,700-year-old universe. And since the rabbi has said to them they're heretics, well, they might as well eat on Yom Kippur and reject everything else, because they already are a heretic. So that's an example where Rav Kook says because the rabbis don't have wide-ranging knowledge, they don't know how to distinguish between what is nikar and what's not, and what can be revisited, and what was only a traditional view, but it's not really an absolute view. Therefore, they end up driving Jews away, into heresy. Whereas if they were able to understand, if they had broader understanding of Jewish philosophy, they would see the boundaries would be very different. So it's quite ironic because usually you think of, the more open-minded thinkers as maybe leading people into heresy. But Rav Kook says it's precisely those who are trying to close thinking off that they're going to lead many Jews away.
So does he talk about pro-science or how he, that obviously is the negative, his negative view. If you don't know more things, then you can have those kind of opinions that you were just saying. But what about his opinions on science and things like that?
Well, see, he's not a scientist. He doesn't have any real background in this. He's read certain basic things in Russian or German or in Hebrew translation. So he's really not about talking about science per se. So evolution comes on the scene. He's not about discussing it, scientifically. His point is that if this theory, and that's what he refers to, if it is proven, if it's true, then how does Torah respond to this? And he doesn't want to say that we reject this necessarily. At the moment, there's no reason to accept it in his time. But he's always thinking ahead because you can't think back to the rabbis, and there were some great ones who said that you have to believe that the sun revolves around the earth. It's explicit verses that say so. Therefore, and if you think otherwise, you're a heretic. And then when science proved otherwise, I guess people would be forgiven if they would say, well, then I can't be a religious Jew because the great rabbi told me that it's heresy. Rav Kook's point was always about building the Torah. The Torah cannot be in opposition to science. So you have to assume that a new theory, which is advocated by many scientists, how will the Torah respond to it if this is proven correct? And the Rambam tells us, and he's following the Rambam's view. The Rambam dealing with the eternity of the universe, eternity of matter, Plato's view that matter is eternal. The Rambam says we don't accept this because we have a tradition that the world was created yesh mi'ayin. But if it would be proven, we could reinterpret the Torah that way. That doesn't mean the Rambam holds this, but he's giving options because the Torah has to deal with any circumstance that's true, which scientifically has to be in line with the Torah. So that's really where Rav Kook's all about, giving options to people on the possibility that certain scientific historical ideas are correct. How then do we deal with this? Practically, he doesn't need to deal with this because it hasn't been proven. And he can continue the way thinking as traditional Jews always have thought. But he does say that, so for instance, evolution, if it is proven correctly, this wouldn't trouble us because it's actually we could see it as in line with Kabbalistic truths. So that's really what Rav Kook's about. He's not in the nitty-gritty, to use that word again. He's just trying to provide an outlook at how to approach these matters.
And not to get stuck in this topic per se, but this does go into something that you discuss more in the book, which is Rav Kook's opinion on the Torah and taking parts of the Torah and saying not literal, and how to teach certain parts of Sefer Bereshis or other parts of Chumash.
Yeah, and especially in Levuchei Ador, he's very interested in the beginnings of Bereshis. We have references to this in his other writings as well, but this is clearly something, if you're writing a guide to the perplexed, that's going to be interesting to people. This is obviously a challenge. Traditional dating, how old the universe is, the story of Bereshis. Already the Rambam, has been interpreted as seeing this all as an allegory of good and evil. So the Rambam, so Rav Kook begins with this idea that we're not bound to any one understanding of the creation story. He says, after all, the sages tell us that you can't teach Ma'aseh Bereshis in public. Well, what do you mean? If it was all literal, if it was meant to be understood literally, I can teach in public. We teach it to 3-year-olds. God created the world. So he says that it's always been understood there's great secrets there. Now, what these secrets are, that's the question. So he begins by acknowledging that he doesn't advocate this, but he says that this is a legitimate option. If you want to interpret the entire creation story, not as literal, but as, say, billions of years old, and that the whole story with Adam and Chava, this is a story of allegory, of humanity, of sin, you can. And he doesn't advocate it personally himself, though he does seem to be moving this direction. but the way he portrays it as he explains how this could be understood this way. Then he raises the question. Well, actually, the question was raised by his student, Moshe Seidel, who was someone he sent off to study Semitics, and he ended up coming to America for a time. And Seidel asked him, well, where do you draw the line? You know, if you're going to tell me that the story of Bereshis and the snake and all that can be understood in a non-literal fashion, because the Torah is not teaching us his history here, but or science, but it's teaching us something much more important. Where do you draw the line? And Rav Kook says that he doesn't know where to draw the line. Obviously, there's a point where the Torah becomes history. Otherwise, there's no, we don't have a history. But he says that the Jewish people as a whole, through their inherent feelings, their connections to the Torah, they will come to a place where this idea will become clearer. But he says, at the moment, I don't have a place. I don't know where exactly, how far you can take this. What about, the story of Cain and Hevel? Is that to be understood literally? Are we all descended from them? Or, Rav Kook acknowledges that there will come a point where it has to be seen historically, but he doesn't know exactly where it is. And he says that this is something that over time it will be worked out by the sages, by the Ruach HaKodesh, maybe you want to call it, of the Jewish people as a whole. So that is clear, that the whole controversy over, he never was troubled by this. In fact, the idea that one day of creation could represent billions of years. I know people cite the Ramban. They say that doesn't trouble him at all. He just dispatches this very quickly. He says it's obvious that you can see this differently, because the Torah is not interested in giving us absolute historical scientific knowledge, and he brings proofs from this. He gives examples from the Gemara that, it's interesting because you have people today like Nathan Aviezer, Gerald Schroeder. They try to read the Psukim of Bereshis and try to show us how the Psukim are really teaching us science. Of course, we didn't understand it till now, but that's their arguments. Rav Kook sees this as a whole category error, that the Torah was never interested in teaching us science per se. That's not what it's about. Just like when it says that the sun rises and sets, it's not interested in teaching us science. It's just a way of speaking. So that's Rav Kook's major point, I would say. So the Torah is not interested in cosmology. It's not interested in geology. In fact, he says that the Torah expresses itself with the knowledge that was believed by people at the time. That's if people believe this, that certain things, that's how the Torah expresses it. They believe that the sun rose and the sun set. That's why the Torah expresses it this way. Dibra Torah K'lshon B'nei Adam. That's what he says.
This whole allegory issue, how far you take it, this is an issue already with the students of the Rambam.
Sure.
So when you get to Ibn Kaspi, get to Ralbag, and others, how far
Actually, the Ralbag is more conservative. The Ralbag thinks that the Rambam is understanding the whole Cain and Hevel episode as an allegory, and he says, what are you talking about? It gives us the genealogy there, so it's not. But yes, they all understand Bereshis chapter 1 and, the whole story of the snake. They all understand that allegorically. But afterwards, how far you take it? And you're right. You mentioned the radical Ibn Kaspi. It's funny that Rav Shlomo Fisher writes in one place in Sefunot, he has a letter there where he attacks Ibn Kaspi. But Rav Shlomo Fisher himself is a great advocate of this idea that the Torah expresses itself in accord with earlier scientific understanding. So the rakia, the whole idea of the rakia with the water above, that's because that's what the people of the time believed. And that's why the Torah expresses it this way. I don't know if this is regarded as heresy. I guess in certain circles it would be, but that's Rav Kook's approach.
We've talked about heresy a bit.
Yeah.
For Rav Kook, where is the line as it relates to heresy?
The line as it relates to heresy, well, it's not clear because you'll have disputes, but he certainly does believe there's heresy. And the standard views, I think, of what heresy is. However, his real jump is this. He has two leaps, I guess you would say. One is that he says, in terms of practical halacha, we follow the Raivad's position on this, the great dispute. The Raivad says that an unwitting heretic, this is in Hilchos Tshuva, someone thinks God has a physical form. If he doesn't know any better, he derives it from the Sukkim, that he's not to be regarded as a heretic. And so Rav Kook, first of all, says that we adopt this position. And, he's not the first, of course. You have the Ravad, but then, although it's not clear that the Ravad actually thought this was heresy, but certainly Yosef Albo uses this to say that even heresy, if someone doesn't know any better, how far you take this as well. If you're an idolater and you think the Torah teaches that, it has to be a line, but that's the basic view. But then Rav Kook says, and this is quite interesting, he says that even if you have a heretical idea, if it's a heretical idea, absolutely, but if it doesn't express itself in the real world, if it doesn't lead to influencing people negatively or lead you to stop observing Torah, that you are not to be regarded as a heretic in the halachic sense. Which is, as far the idea that we go like the Ravad, an unwitting heretic is not a heretic. Rav Kook didn't invent this, but I don't know of anyone before Rav Kook who comes up with this idea that if your heretical view does not manifest itself as in a negative way in the real world, that we are not going to treat you as you are a heretic. Now, this related to this is something interesting. Everyone knows that Rav Kook was welcoming to the pioneers who came to rebuild the land, even though they were anti-religious. Many of them were atheists. There's a letter from the Ridbaz of Yaakov Dostoevsky of Tzfat. He writes a letter to Rav Kook rebuking him. How can you treat these people this way? They're heretics. And there are halachas about them. Today we forget about this, but there's halachas, how to treat it. You can't give a Shemachal Shabbos, an Aliyah, and all these halachas, which today we assume they're all Tinok Shenishba, so, we don't really put these into practice. But there are halachas. So Rav Kook responds, and he says something amazing. He says that all these halachas in the Gemara that tell us how to relate to heretics, he says there's two types of heretics. There's those heretics that have what we call a segula, a connection to the Jewish people. And obviously you saw these pioneers. They could have gone to London or New York or Paris. They could have been Bundist in Vilna. No, they give up the best years of their life, move to the land of Israel, drain the malaria swamps, have to deal with marauding, Palestinians. They weren't called Palestinians then, but, how can you judge these people the same way as you judge just a Stam heretic who wants nothing to do with the Jewish people? Even though they don't recognize it themselves, the fact is that these people have a segula. And we can see that today, obviously, after October 7th. You have plenty of Jews who are not connected religiously or halachically, but you saw that they feel a connection. They give tzedakah, they're part of the Jewish people. So Rav Kook makes a distinction in different types of heretics, and those who have the segula, who are connected to the Jewish people, they are not the heretics that the sages spoke about. So that's also quite an original position, I think.
Now, these positions, were they set out as like theological positions that did he mean to tell them over to people, or were these type of things, because we've talked about some of his writings were like musings, or they were private diaries or things like that.
Yeah. Well, the one I just said about the heresy, that's written in a letter to the Ridbaz, the letter which is actually been translated. So that is clearly his position. That's his public position. A lot of the other ideas we're speaking about, many of them were not published. Everything in the Minvuchei Ador, which things I mentioned before, they didn't appear. So what does this mean? Does this mean that Rav Kook abandoned it? For so many of his important ideas, though, that are elaborated at greater length, his idea about the Torah not necessarily reflecting history, but something much deeper. You can find references to that in his published writings as well, in Eder Hayakar. He speaks about this. So for many of the ideas, you can find lots of parallels. There are a few where you don't have really hardly any parallels. But for the most part, he hints to it here or there, or you do have a passage. What we find in the new writings is much more elaboration. So for instance, on Karbonos, and we'll get to that later. That's where only with the newly published writings do you find in greater detail and his ideas of natural morality. And I was happy to hear that the sponsor thought that that's an important idea. And about other religions, his view of other religions. In fact, Eitam Henkin, either he told me this or he wrote this, I can't remember. He believes that the reason Minvuchei Ador was suppressed was because of what Rav Kook says about other religions. Those ideas are not found anywhere in any of his other writings, to my knowledge.
Well, let's talk about that. You can talk about other religions or natural morality, as you mentioned, as correct, as the sponsor mentioned. That talk about some of those in Rav Kook's opinion there.
Okay, so Listen, every Jew understands that there are certain times you have a sense, you have a feeling of something, a direction, that things you should be doing. And it doesn't necessarily, you can't point to a source per se. Rav Kook sees natural morality as something known intuitively, a form of revelation. Now, so you have two types of revelation. You have the Torah's revelation, and then you have this natural morality. Now, today it's a little hard to speak about it because we're so much in the books. But think about maybe your grandparents, your great-grandparents who you knew who weren't learned, but they understood what it meant to be a religious Jew. It was something mimetic, to use Chaim Soloveitchik's term, or through osmosis. Once you recognize this notion of natural morality, then you can also recognize something else, that natural morality develops. It's not frozen in time. So, for instance, the fact that people today, you think of something like slavery, it bothers them. This isn't because they've been indoctrinated in Western values. No, this is coming from their heart. The more morally they know this is slavery is wrong, and then you have to deal with what do you do with the Torah. But the point is that. And Rav Kook, he says this to Moshe Seidel, when we speak about natural morality, it's not about an evolution of Torah teachings. Torah teachings don't evolve. However, Torah teachings are latent. They're in there waiting for different generations. The fact that today we're more, let's say, conscious of human rights, this doesn't mean that we're greater than previous generations, but certain ideas were only intended over time to be revealed. Now, when you have this natural morality, how far are you going to take this? Well, that's the role of the Sanhedrin. There will be times that the Sanhedrin, that's the role of the Sanhedrin, to actualize new moral and religious insights that become apparent, because otherwise our natural, how we determine if it's really natural morality or if we're just being influenced by the outside world. So therefore you need that's Rav Kook's idea of the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin is supposed to determine if these new moral and religious insights, which we claim to be bringing out from the Torah, if they are really there or if not. Now, I think I gave an example in a footnote there, which I think is a good example. Of course, it postdates Rav Kook, but before I mention it, let me just go back a second. Rav Kook is radical in the sense that he says that natural morality is found among the religious masses, not among the rabbis. The rabbis have all sorts of important things that we need. They teach us halacha and everything, but when it comes, they're so involved in learning, especially the details, that they can be led to be matarat hasheretz. They can be led in all sorts of improper, even immoral ways, because they're only focusing on the halacha without seeing the broader picture. He says it's, in yeshivas, of course, we're taught that the masses really have nothing to give. The masses only receive. They receive from the great rabbis. For Rav Kook, there's a dialectic here. The great rabbis, of course, give us, but the masses have a lot. The rabbis need the masses because the masses keep them honest, as it were, because the pure morality, which hasn't been deformed by too much Talmudic dialectics, is found among the religious masses. So they each need each other. Now, just think how subversive this is, to say that the rabbis need the religious masses because the religious masses preserve the natural morality. But that's that he develops, and I think we saw an example of this. Don't want to get myself in trouble, but it's in the book, so I can say it. I mean, if you think back to the sexual abuse scandal, it was many of the great rabbis who just focused on pure halachic particulars. You have to analyze it. Do we have enough proof that we can go to the police and therefore we can cover it up because it's only maybe a rabbinic probe? All these reasons they came up with, but it was the religious masses, even in the Haredi world, who recognized that this was wrong. And now, if you have a Das Torah perspective, this is going to be very problematic. How is it that the religious masses pushed an issue which now today I think we all recognize was an important thing if the rabbis didn't recognize this? But from Rav Kook, it all makes perfect sense. Because how do you know about the devastating impact of sexual abuse? You don't know this from the Gemara. These psychological insights are not mentioned. We know it from modern understandings of psychology. And this is something that the Gedolim haven't been exposed to, but the religious masses, both through their own basic intuition and their understandings of the world in a way that the rabbis perhaps don't have, they're the ones who sense this. So we see that works very well with Rav Kook's idea of natural morality, that the masses, the religious masses, have something they can give to the rabbi, because not everything can be derived from, Talmudic text. There's a second revelation. And this, this we can go on for hours speaking about it, because some people would deny the whole notion that there is a natural morality. But on the other hand, natural morality would seem to be implied by many. I mean, how is it that non-Jews are supposed to know that the Sheva Mitzvahs and Noach are binding on them, even without a revelation? That has to come from natural morality. How is a Jew supposed to know that certain things are prohibited, that you can't worship idols if he was not taught? I mean, so Rav Kook is a big believer in this idea of natural morality.
Now, you mentioned other religions, and that being maybe the very reason why this book was suppressed.
Okay, so here you have stuff which I totally acknowledge are radical views, and it's hard to justify them from traditional texts, although they will appeal to many people today who can't accept the idea that that the whole world, all the billions of people, that their lives just have no spiritual meaning. What Rav Kook said is that Judaism, of course, is the highest religion, and Torah is given to the Jews. However, that doesn't mean that the rest of the world is just individuals who are lacking Torah or lacking Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach. No, he believes that there were great figures in the past. He even says they could be Nevi'im, and who God spoke to them. And does this mean that God spoke to them, or they sensed, in a sense, God's word? I mean, you can read it differently, and they, in their communities, tried to better the people. Now, these people were connected to idolatry, and the time was not yet ripe for them to abandon idolatry, because then they would have no religion. So for those people, led by their spiritual leaders, this was the best way they should live. So what Rav Kook says is that for certain civilizations, idolatry, avodah zarah, is a good way for them because they're not yet ready to advance beyond that, and at least it gives them some basic morality, and this is their ways of striving for God. So that already is an unusual position. But then he goes further than that, because as humanity develops, you have the two great religions, Judaism and Christianity, and Rav Kook is willing to acknowledge, obviously there's all sorts of distortions in Christianity, but speaking from the beginning, he's willing to acknowledge, he says, the founders of these religions, which have to be Jesus and Muhammad, that they could have been inspired, divinely inspired. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't necessarily mean God spoke to them, but it means that in a sense that they were given this sense, the divine inspiration, that these religions were created in order, Rav Emden says this about Christianity, to bring people in line with basic morality, with connections to God. And he goes so far as to say that it shouldn't even trouble us if we hear that in other religions, miracles were performed. Because this is for them, it's not for us. So there's definitely a hierarchy, but the idea that other peoples and their religions have truth with a small t, let's say, but they have prophets, they have leaders. In other words, it's not all negative. Rav Kook is asking us to view other religions, to see them in a positive way for what they do for their peoples who are not yet ready to advance to the absolute truth. This is at odds with the notions normally found that when you look at avodah zarah, you look at other religions, even if they're not avodah zarah, it's all negative. And the idea is that, the only option for a non-Jew is Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach, with a recognition that it's given from God. For many people, looking around the world, this is going to be troubling. That's all there is. So Rav Kook has a much broader understanding of the role of religion. And as we go on, as humanity progresses, these religions will also be purified. The problem with Christianity is it moved in the direction of idolatry. It moved away from where it should have been, but yet there still are positive aspects to it. Now, that's in Vuchei Ador, but later on in his writings, Rav Kook has a much more negative view of Christianity. He might even call it Christophobia. But so it could be that he changed his view about this, and that could be why it was thought it wasn't appropriate to publish these writings. But that's what he says about other religions. And I don't know of anyone who says this, but I used his idea about miracles. I think we can explain something based on this. I'm sure many of the listeners know about Toldos Yeshu. Okay, we have these stories that, obviously the New Testament has stories of Jesus doing miracles. So I think most people, if you ask most people today, they would say, well, we don't believe it. Of course we don't believe it. How could Jesus do miracles? But in Toldos Yeshu, it acknowledges that Jesus did miracles. And by the way, we have medieval Jewish texts that also acknowledge Christian saints can do miracles. Why does Torah, if we can very easily simply say that, of course, these are phony stories. We don't believe that Jesus ever did any miracles. Why does Toldus Yeshu acknowledge Jesus' miracles? So I think it probably has to do with the fact they had this notion, maybe like a Kuzari type of argument, that all these thousands of people are described as seeing him do these miracles, so it must have happened. Of course, for Toldus Yeshu, how did he do the miracles? He do the miracles because he grabbed the Shem HaMeforash, or from the dark side. You can do it from the Sitra Achra, but they acknowledge that these things happened. So I think Rav Kook, he too is working on this, the idea that we're not troubled that they do miracles. He's, unlike Toldus Yeshu, though, he's not going to attribute it necessarily to the dark side or anything like that. But God doesn't only speak to the Jewish people. God could speak to the entire world. And if God chose some other prophet or some other figure to bring his message, if a miracle was going to help that, then that's fine. We don't need to deny these things because we have the highest revelation, and that's what we're focused on. How God relates to the other peoples of the world, that's not our concern. And so this is, it's not relativist. It's not a relativist position about religion, but on the other hand, it's a recognition that other religions could also have their own connection to God. Truth at a much lower level, but still there. Now that, even with all my explanations, it's at odds with, the tradition as how we see in the Talmud, the Rishonim and Achronim, how they view the other religions, with one perhaps exception, Rav Nathanael ben Yeshaya, the medieval figure, who does state that God sent prophets to, it's not a major figure. One of the Rambam's letters was written to his father, or son, I forget now. But he says that God sent prophets to all the other nations, and that's where their religions come from. And then, of course, they began a certain way. They could have distorted them over time. But, there is this idea of Bilam, and there are non-Jewish prophets. So the idea that God could, we say, like, God works in mysterious ways, that's what Rav Kook is working on. And I think he's reflecting the idea that the world as we know it, with all these other people with their different religions, is it all negative, or is there something positive that we can derive from this? In fact, he goes so far as to say that even the idea, normally we assume, even Yaakov Emden, who's quite tolerant of Christianity, says Eretz Yisrael, however, that's different. In Eretz Yisrael, there's no shita fallout. It has to be pure monotheism. Rav Kook says that all the halachos about destroying the idolaters, etc., he said that has to go before the Beis Din. And if the Beis Din determines that in this circumstance this is better for these people, it will allow a temporary stay, as it were.
Now, what about Kabbalah? Rav Kook is obviously well versed in Kabbalah, and you mentioned this already before, that some of his thought, influenced by Kabbalah. But what is his opinion on Kabbalah? Who should learn Kabbalah? When to learn Kabbalah?
Rav Kook, of course, is a great makubal. That's his great achievement in his own mind, I think. Rav Kook does quote the standard view that Kabbalah is only for those who filled their bellies with Shas and Poskim, but he diverges because he says that that's only a general rule. For some people who are especially drawn to this, there is room for allowing them to immerse themselves in Kabbalah even before they reach that level. Again, this is probably in line with Hasidic ideas, but the Kabbalah is really the essence of Judaism. And the Nazir at least quotes him as saying that we don't need to be, on the Rashbi, the Zohar. That's not what we're concerned with. But the idea that Kabbalah is the essence of Judaism, he does cite Mar Nevuchim and he cites philosophical texts, but fundamentally he's a Makubal, and yet you can read many of his writings and gain a lot from it without even entering into Kabbalah, because he's such a writer that he presents, for everyone. So just because you're not into Kabbalah, you don't study it, doesn't mean you can't access Rav Kook. There are many passages, however, that you won't even understand without an understanding of Kabbalah. And Yosef Avivi, in Eretz Yisrael, he's devoted great efforts to expounding on Rav Kook's notions of Kabbalah. What I said in the introduction of the book is that, especially like you take the modern Orthodox world, which feels attached to Rav Kook, Kabbalah doesn't really play such an important role there. But this doesn't mean that you don't have Rav Kook. There's so much in Rav Kook which has nothing to do with Kabbalah.
You mentioned earlier couple of things that we should pick up on that you mentioned before we finish up. Is one of them is Sanhedrin.
Yeah. Well, Rav Kook originally thought in some of his writings that even before the coming of the Mashiach, we could have a Sanhedrin revival. But he seems to back away from this. But he does understand that the Sanhedrin is going to be important because for Rav Kook, certain laws that we have are really not suitable anymore, but we have no mechanism to adjust them. We can't change them. So we're sort of bound to them in they're obligating us, but it's sort of like we're waiting for the time when a Sanhedrin comes and it'll change these laws. Because Rav Kook says that, over the exile, there have been all sorts of chumras that have been added on, and this even includes in the Talmudic period. He says we're not going to be bound by these in the time of the Mashiach. He says we're not even going to be bound by Talmud Bavli in the time of the Mashiach. He says many of these chumras were designed for us living under the non-Jews in exile. There'll be new chumras in the days of Mashiach, suitable for free people living in their land. But Jewish law will change in the Messianic period. Now, people look at this and say, this is reformist. It's not. This is exactly what the Rambam says in Hilchos Mamrim, that the sages, the Sanhedrin, can change laws. In fact, the Sanhedrin is able, they don't even have to be greater than the previous ones to change drushos. So many of our halachas come out of drushos. The idea, for instance, that women can't be witnesses, that's derived in the Talmud from a drasha. A later Sanhedrin can make a new drasha and change that. And Rav Kook believes that there's going to be a dialectic here as well between natural morality, people's feelings, and the halachic system. What do I mean by this? Well, the Sanhedrin will determine that certain feelings of people are the proper feelings and are in line with the civilization they're living in. The Sanhedrin has the ability, through the use of its powers to create Jewish law through drashot, to change the way we've been practicing it. This is not reformist. This is exactly what the Rambam says. And one example of this is sacrifices, his view of sacrifices. Now, there's been a lot written on sacrifices, and really, we didn't know enough about the Rambam's view until the new writings, because you have many passages from Rav Kook where he affirms, and he's a Kohen, of course, but he affirms that there will be sacrifices in the future. And then there's this one passage and he has one passage where he speaks about maybe we get ways that we will not have sacrifices. And in his Siddur, he has another passage where he speaks about a future of vegetarian sacrifices. In my book, I mistakenly wrote vegetable. I should have said vegetarian because he speaks about grains as well. And they're not vegetables, but it's vegetarian. And this has always been a problem, because what about the Rambam's ninth principle, the Torah is eternal, Karban Pesach and everything? How can you even have this? So, and then the Rambam, like I said, and then Rav Kook contradicts himself. He has a famous literature of Chaim Hershenson, the Rav of Hoboken, very interesting thinker and rabbi. He argued that there won't be animal sacrifice in the days of the Beis Hamikdash, and Rav Kook writes to him, why do you say this? Of course there's going to be. You're adopting, Western views. So how to bring them all together? And in my book on the limits of Orthodox theology, I quoted Rav Goren's suggestion. Others have said it as well, that maybe Rav Kook distinguished between the early part of the Messianic era versus the later. Well, now it's all clear from the new writings. The first thing to note is that Rav Kook believed that spilling of blood is all a concession. Any blood, animal blood, is a concession, and that one day we will move beyond this. Well, then what are you going to do with sacrifice? Okay, so this is all going to tie in. Now, when we say spilling of blood is a concession, Rav Kook was not a vegetarian. In fact, he spoke against vegetarianism because there's so many problems in the world today. You're going to worry about the animals. We have to deal with people. But there will come a time when we'll return to that state in Gan Eden where we physically can't spill blood. So how does this tie into sacrifices? Well, in the new writings, Rav Kook raises the question. And he says, this idea that in the future there will only be vegetarian sacrifices. What about the Rambam's ninth principle, that the Torah is eternal? Now, the Rav Kook could have said that, there's positions that disagree with the Rambam's ninth principle. Someone I know wrote a book dealing with certain, disagreements with the Rambam's principles, but he doesn't say that. He says, even in line with the Rambam. And he develops the idea, and he doesn't say this is going to be the absolute truth. He says there still might be sacrifices. He says the animals might willingly choose to offer themselves as offerings to bring tikkun. But he also gives this option. He says that, and this is not in opposition to the Rambam's ninth principle. He says that Yes, there are sacrifices, absolutely. But that's dealing with the animals we have today. So, for instance, in the future, he speaks about Kabbalistically, animals will be raised to a much higher level. They won't be the animals we have today. And therefore, they'll be like humans are now. And therefore, sacrificing them, we're not sacrificing animals anymore. He also says that the Sanhedrin, that's the job of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin will sense when the people no longer are suitable. It's no longer suitable for the people to offer sacrifices. And they'll use their authority. And he tells you, it's almost like he's imagining himself on the future Sanhedrin. He gives you the drushos they will use. So, for instance, reach nichoach. We know that a sacrifice has to be a reach nichoach. Well, in the future, when it's no longer a reich nichoach, when people physically cannot eat meat, the Sanhedrin will be able to give a drasha that it no longer applies because it's no longer a reich nichoach. So the Rav Kook sees the possibilities, not saying it's absolutely, but he sees the possibility, and that seems to be his real view of a future that we will move beyond this because we're becoming closer to like angels. And therefore, and that's going to be in the Messianic era, where we already have traditions about certain Torah laws changing. So even sacrifices at one time in the future, far off, we will reach the point where that will itself be changed. And this does not violate the ninth principle. And this is in line with Rav Kook's ideas. Rav Kook believes that many laws, sacrifices is different because, there's commandments about this. So that's why he approaches this way. But so, for instance, war, Milchamas Mitzvah. The Rav Kook speaks about how in the future there won't be a concept of war. But we're not ready for it yet. Yafat Torah. There'll be a time when we'll move beyond this. So Rav Kook recognizes this idea that certain laws are required now, but there's sort of for an era when we haven't moved. Well, Chazal already recognized this by Yafat Torah. That's because people have Yetzer Hara. It would be better if they didn't have that. So Rav Kook develops this idea that certain laws don't have to be seen as the ceiling, but as the floor, and that over time, as we become more and more refined, they'll remain on the books, but they will no longer be practiced. There won't be war. There won't be slavery. We'll all move to a certain level that will move beyond this. So this also is going to be radical for certain people. But I think for these ideas, the sacrifice idea he's breaking new ground, if you want to put it that way. But the idea that certain laws, Yafat Torah, war, slavery, others have spoken about this as well, that certain laws reflect an era that, we can move. Rav Henkin writes that as we move closer to the Messianic era, our Yetzer Hara to kill is lessened. Although I don't know, it's hard to say that if you look around the world today. But he says that that's how you explain why the future Sanhedrin won't have to execute people. Because, we're not going to have this problem anymore in the future. And that's a good thing. So that's his radical view of sacrifices. And again, it all goes back to the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is the one, this can't be done on your own. You need the Sanhedrin because only the Sanhedrin can determine when the so-called natural morality, when the religious instinct is authentic, and when it's just parroting things you've absorbed from the outside. So the Sanhedrin is our check. It's the check and balance on really how Judaism develops. And it's going to go back to an era in the future for Rav Kook where prophecy will be revised. Remember, the whole oral law is written, and then it can't really develop the way it used to be because it's codified. Well, we're going to go back to a pre-codification era. So all these are ideas that some people might see as strange, as radical. Look, if you look at the Briskers, what is the Messianic era? That now you can spend all your time focusing on Rava and Abaye and all that. Rav Kook sees us as a return, to an era where God communicated to us through Ruach HaKodesh, and we can sense God's presence in a different way, and we won't need the written text as much. In fact, Rav Kook sees the Talmud Bavli as really giving way in the Messianic era to the approach of the Talmud Yerushalmi, which is more of Torah Eretz Yisrael. So these ideas are going to be very thrilling for some people, and other people are going to find them just way out in left field. And there's a Hasidic guy who came to a talk I gave in London, and in fact, he's a Rosh Hashiva, actually, and he said afterwards, he goes, now I understand why the Frummer were so opposed to many of Rav Kook's ideas.
Even though these ideas weren't so known. So you end off the book And
but enough ideas were known. Yeah.
You end with a short conclusion, and you ask, what are we to take from him? Like, what are we to take from this? So anyone listening is probably like, okay, these are a lot of radical, out there, interesting ideas. Definitely not these type of ideas. Mostly, we're not discussing that series in Rav Kook. So, indeed, what is a listener or reader is supposed to take from this?
Well, I don't. As I say, I don't think Rav Kook takes us to the. I don't think we have to adopt his conclusions. What I think is important is that Rav Kook showed us a way of thinking, and maybe I can even read to you. I say that, for instance, his view of women. He had a view of women that I don't think many people would. They did more Victorian view. He was the leader of the opposition to women voting. Many things that even his great followers are not going to follow him on. But Rav Kook, he's not a Rebbe in the sense that the Hasidim have a Rebbe. He's an inspiring thinker, and he showed us the way, I think. We might not end up in the same place as him, but the idea that Torah is effervescent and that it doesn't have to fear from science and that it recognizes, some of these ideas I think are great. The idea that the Jewish religious masses carry in them a revelation from God, as it were. Kol Hamon Kechol Shaddai is an expression already known from the Rishonim, that these are ideas that I think are very powerful, and that we can use these ideas, even if we don't end up in his same place, we can use them every generation has its own challenges. Our challenges are very different than Rav Kook's challenges, but he showed us how to respond to challenges. In fact, and I'll give you an example, which I think many people today would find of use. You think about the state of Israel today. Everyone thinks about Rav Kook as a great Zionist. But yes, he was. And there's no question that Rav Kook saw the return to Israel as God guiding us in a direction that would lead to the Messianic era. But the state of Israel is obviously much more than this. How many people know that Rav Kook expressed satisfaction that Jews are not engaged in politics? It says, we reached a very low level in the times of the Second Temple. If you know the history, you know the problems of the Jewish community then. And Rav Kook tells us that we were forced to leave the world of politics. The Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. That's a terrible thing. But on the other hand, there's something positive in that we were not then suitable. We had lost the ability to conduct ourselves in a political entity in a proper way in accord with Torah. We were it was a time of wickedness, of barbarism. And he says that when the day will arise when once again we are ready for that. Now, was that 1948? Absolutely not. Rav Kook is speaking about a time that everyone's going to be religious, they'll sense God. So Rav Kook, when you talk about Rav Kook and religious Zionism and reaching its fruition in the state of Israel, there's no question that in Rav Kook's mind, we were not yet ready for a state. It came prematurely. Because Rav Kook imagines a time when we're all going to be, when a future state, he calls it Medinat Yisrael, by the way. That's, his followers believe this is real prophecy, because they didn't pick the name Israel until 1948 when it was declared. Some people wanted to call it Judea, which was the last Jewish commonwealth. So Rav Kook is imagining a future when we'll be ready. Now look, God goes in his own time. He gave us the state here, so we have to deal with it. But the idea that it's an absolute gift without any problems in it, do people know that Rav Yehuda Kook, he cried the day that the state of Israel, that the United Nations vote came down? How could you cry? Everyone else is down in the street cheering. Because Rav Kook and his followers understand that the world is complex. Yes, happiness that we have a state. On the other hand, we don't have Hebron. We don't have Yerushalayim. The community is not religious. What's that going to lead to? So there's there's a sophistication here, and there's a nuance that people often forget. And even about this great idea of having a state, Rav Kook recognized that doesn't mean we're all ready for it. And it's totally understandable, the early years of the state, that even to this day, that it's not conducted the way it should be in line with Torah values, because we're not yet ready to run ourselves in the complete Torah fashion, but we're moving in that direction, hopefully. And that's so. These are all Rav Kook is a thinker that if you're looking for simplicity, you're not going to get it. If you're looking for contradictions and how these contradictions are merged into some sort of synthesis, that's what you'll find in Rav Kook.
what has the reception of the book been? As we've discussed here, this has been some interesting topics and opinions, to say the least. So what kind of feedback, positive, negative, have you received since publication?
Well, I mean, that's there's no reason to be upset with me if someone doesn't like some of the ideas, because I'm just expounding on them. Of course, if you think I expounded incorrectly, you could, but no one has said that so far. I think the feedback has been very positive, because what I've done, at least I hope I've done, is reveal an aspect of Rav Kook, or at least expound on an aspect of Rav Kook that wasn't so well known. Dov Schwartz, in his review, sees my book as basically providing a modern a view of Rav Kook for the modern Orthodox, which I don't think at all. And those who read my book know that I go into all sorts of tangents on all sorts of other areas, as is my fashion. I think it's a book for anyone who's interested in Jewish philosophy, in Jewish thinking. Whether you accept Rav Kook's ideas or not doesn't really matter, because he's willing to face these challenging ideas, and all our great thinkers had radical ideas. That's what made them great thinkers, that they couldn't be kept in a constricted. And Rav Kook, as you mentioned already right at the beginning, what I said, if you pick up his writings, you're hooked, because hardly a page goes by in Rav Kook's writings that you don't see some insight that you find like, wow, it's so fascinating that he would come to that position. So I think I've done my little share to expand knowledge of Rav Kook and his great thinking. Now, much of what I said might have to be overturned with the new writings that come out. As far as I know, new books remain to appear, but you have to stop sometime and deal with what you have. And nothing has come out in the last 5 years or so.
Yeah, I'll link to the book in the show notes. It's $37.95 list price, but it's often on sale on Amazon. Now it's like $32.99 when I'm looking now. So
it used to be much cheaper, yeah.
Yeah, it goes up and down. Amazon fluctuates. Okay, so what are you working on now? Your books cover the gamut, all different types of topics. So what are you working on now?
I'm completing a book I hope will be done by this summer, Menachem, on the Besamim Rosh of Shaul Berlin, the great forgery. There's different ways of how to view it. Is it all forgery? How to understand him? What I'm trying to do is my argument is going to be that there's much more subversive and anachronistic elements in the book that have been realized until now. So I cite all sorts of passages. There are certain famous responses of the Besamim Rosh that everyone cites, going back already to Mordechai Bennett. But I think I've been able to uncover many other smoking guns, as it were. So I think it might not have the same broad appeal as the book on Rav Kook or the book that's going to come after that, which is a halachic history of America. But I think for many of the listeners of the Sfarim Chatter who like these byways and highways of Jewish history and Jewish bibliography, you'll find much to keep you busy in the book on the Besamim Rosh, which I'm sure is your host's. I'm sure it's one of his great loves as well. It's such a fascinating story.
Yeah, fascinating story, exactly. Sfarim, forgery, yes, no, all the different Gedolim involved.
One of the Gedolim who went to the dark side, all the Gedolim who refused to recognize this.
Yes.
Yeah, so there's a lot to say.
Fascinating topic. Very much looking forward to that. Okay, and like I said, I'll link to the book on Rav Kook here, and thank you for joining me on the podcast once again.
Okay, my pleasure.